Fire Force is the perfect example of world building done right. Most of you will bring up One Piece or Lord of the Rings, and those are great examples as well. But Fire Force is a series that people claim is only for meatheads, or they'll say they like the story but not the characters. But one element of Fire Force that I never see get nearly enough credit is the world building. Now, what makes it so great is that on top of building a nuanced world that is fully involved in the entire story, Ohkubo does something that is pretty fitting for a story called Fire Force, but is very hard to do well. He burns the world to the ground, which is why in this video, I'd like to explore the institutional influences and lore of Fire Force, discuss how Ohkubo rewards readers for engaging in this world, and explain why the best thing you can do to a carefully crafted world is to set it on fire. Now to start, let's just make sure we're clear on what world building really means and how it's talked about. Most people would rightfully assume that it's the process of creating a fictional world, but there's more to it than that. One of the best definitions of world building comes from Merriam-Webster, which defines world building as the creation of a fictional world that is believable and consistent within the context of the story. This part that I've highlighted is a very important but often neglected aspect of world building. In the case of One Piece, for example, everyone knows that's good world building, but the way most people explain it isn't completely accurate. Because if you want to argue that, say, Fire Force has better world building, most people would turn the conversation into a simple matter of math, claiming that One Piece is better simply because it has more world building. But it's not just about sheer volume. You can come up with all of the geography and rules that you want, but if one area of the world isn't believable, then the system as a whole suffers. And this is why there's generally two styles of world building. Soft world building aims to give you the very bare minimum information so that you, the reader, may fill in the gaps and come to your own understanding of the world. Fire Force would fall under the other style called hard world building, which is something like One Piece or Lord of the Rings, which seeks to create a believable world by giving it so many details that you are aware of all the little cogs that keep the world spinning. Now, neither of these is inherently better than the other, but you do have to commit to one of them, which is where some manga tend to get into trouble. But we'll talk about that more as we walk through each step of world building. For now, just know that the goal of world building is to present the world of the story in such a way that readers find it believable given the in-world context. This is generally talked about more in the context of fantasy and sci-fi, but can apply to our universe as well. For example, while a story like Golden Kamuy wouldn't fit because it's a work of historical fiction that mostly sticks to the actual history, Dr. Stone makes use of world building because it's a story of our planet 3,700 years after a global petrification. Naturally, Fire Force falls into a similar category because it uses our world as the foundation and builds off of that with its own world building. So we know what world building is supposed to look like, and we know that Fire Force has it, but what makes Fire Forces so great? Well, as I'm sure you know, not all world building is made equal, and there's at least 4 steps a writer needs to take in order to take their world building from good to great. And in the case of Fire Force, Ohkubo does all of them brilliantly. Actually, real quick, before I get into those steps, make sure to join the channel if you're enjoying the video so far. You'll get this custom Excalibur emoji and loyalty badges, and you can pick which series I cover next. But, like I was saying, there's at least 4 steps to world building. The first step is to present the basic premise of the story right away. Lord of the Rings does this with the story about each of the races in the rings. One Piece does this with Gold Roger. The reason you need to do this right away is because, first of all, you have to give the reader the basic idea, the answer to the question, what's this about? Then you can get into all the different factions and languages because now the reader understands how they relate to that premise. Fire Force does this as you're told in the very beginning how spontaneous combustion is plaguing the earth, and the Fire Force was started to fight fires and put infernals to rest. From here, everything that we learn makes sense. Like you learn about the religion in Fire Force and you understand it because of the issue of Infernals. So that's step 1. Step 2, obviously, is to do some world building. In other words, now you build on the premise that you've presented. Again, this varies depending on the style of world building, but you do have to commit to one or the other. Where a lot of stories hurt themselves is that they start out with hard world building, but then as the story progresses, they don't follow up. Jujutsu Kaisen is an example of this because it does a good job of fleshing out Japan, but mostly ignores the rest of the world. And I know this is a hot take, but I'd also throw Soul Eater in there as well. Soul Eater starts off strong, but some of the stuff in the later half of the story is kind of left to your imagination. Granted, some of that stuff does get recontextualized, but hold that thought for the end of the video. Anyone who's seen Fire Force knows Ohkubo does a great job of fleshing out this world. There's the religion that arises as an answer to Infernals, the empire that controls the church and the corporations, the connections between the Fire Force, the military, the church, the corporations, and the empire, the intricate power system that consists of different generations of fire powers, the proto-nationalists in Asakusa that want to retain their cultural identities, and there's plenty more. But it doesn't necessarily matter how much world building there is. Like we mentioned, it's more a question of how believable you make the world. Now, why should it be believable if it's a fictional world? It doesn't need to be realistic, but it does need to make sense given the in-world context. That's how you get readers engaged. Otherwise, it's a guaranteed way to take them out of the story. And this is why that first step is so important. We already know that civilians are constantly peeing their pants because they think they might explode at any moment. So of course they would make a religion to cope with that. And of course the Empire would use that religion to control people because the Infernals are so scary, so the church has that much influence. But just because a world is believable doesn't mean it comes without questions. And this is where we get to step 3.
Nothing is true. Everything is permitted.
That is rather cynical.
Making the reader question the world early on. And by this, I don't mean you have to make the reader hypothetically undermine everything. Rather, you should make them question the story as it's presented. In Skyrim, for example, a dragon pops out of nowhere and it's like, oh, so there's dragons now and we need to stop them. And the first question all of the characters have is, why are the dragons returning? So as you're returning to Whiterun to inform them of the dragons, you're wondering why the dragons are back. You also see this in Solo Leveling. You get the premise of the invading monsters and the first episode happens. But the first question in your head is, why are there suddenly these video game powers? The idea is that you don't just want to present this elaborate world and then be like, okay, go. You want to present it in such a way that the reader questions the world as they learn about it. This is something that Ohkubo does at every step in Fire Force. Once we get the basic premise of the Infernals, the very next thing we see is Captain Obi explaining to Shinra the difference between simply killing Infernals and saving them. Soon after, we meet a talking Infernal in Company 5 and learn that Hibana is capturing Infernals and experimenting on them. So we find out that Captain Obi started Company 8 because he wants to find out about the cause of combustion and learn more about the Infernals. At this point, you're wondering what really causes the combustions. Is the Fire Force involved? And does the Fire Force have some kind of ulterior motive? So you get the premise right away. That gives you the context for all of the intricate world building. And as you're engaging with the story by learning about all the institutions and how they interact, you're also engaging with it by questioning those institutions. But that's not enough, because then you need to follow that up with the fourth and most important step, integrating the world building with the core struggle of the plot. This is what separates separates good world building from great world building. Because it's one thing to have this sophisticated world, but it's another thing to have the world actually influence the events of the story, in the context of role-playing, whether it be in D&D or a video game. It's one thing to give yourself a basic character sheet. You also need to give your character a backstory, but then you need to build on that backstory in a way that it influences the decisions you make later on. Now, admittedly, I was not a huge fan of Fire Force at first. I thought it was pretty cool, but the villains felt like Team Rocket in white robes, and I felt the story took too long to get anywhere. But after a second read-through, and especially after reading a story like Soul Eater that ramps up fast, I came to appreciate how Fire Force takes its time. The early arcs are fairly low stake. It's a lot of like, hey, we need to stop the bad guys because they're being evil. But while that's happening, Ohkubo is presenting the world, fleshing it out with all of the politics and institutions, and making you question everything that's presented. The reason the story might feel slow at first is because he's doing all of this while they're tying it into the central plot. So the first few arcs deal with the other companies and how they're tied to the Infernals and the Whiteclads. You also meet Joker, who makes us question everything we know. By the time you get about 40 chapters in, or the second half of Season 1, everything starts to ramp up. In Asakusa, you have the struggle between Company 8, Company 7, and the Whiteclad, and you meet the legendary Benimaru. In the next arc, you meet Vulcan, and you learn how his ancestors built a mysterious key, and how the Whiteclads are after that key. Then the characters go to the Netherworld, where there's abandoned parts of Tokyo. They confront all of the Whiteclads, and Shinra finds out about the Adula Burst. And this continues throughout the story. With each new arc, our understanding of the world and the characters in that world grows simultaneously. The story ramps up exponentially, and while you do have transitions, you don't have filler arcs like people call them. Every single arc in the story is a direct consequence of some sort of influence from the world building, and every event in the story has a meaningful impact on the world. In fact, one of the best examples of this is the Holy Soul Temple arc. This arc feels like it comes out of nowhere because you're following Shinra and Company 8, and suddenly it's just two of the story's most badass characters teaming up to take down the church. It feels random because there's two characters who have never interacted and don't have any history. But as we know, Benimaru leads the proto-nationalists and is motivated by his distrust for the Empire. And as we soon find out, Joker is doing this because he was a dark agent for the church, so he wants to get revenge by finding out the truth. It seems like a random team-up, but it's really the result of the Empire's cover-ups and attempts to manipulate everyone. And this is how Ohkubo makes even the most seemingly random events in the story all tie together. Everything is connected in this elegant system, which makes it all the more better when he breaks that system down in arcs like Holy Soul Temple. And that brings us to the secret step number 5, and the whole point of this video, namely, burning the world to the ground. Now, why do I say this? Well, think about it like this. The goal of world building is believability, right? And the best way to do that is to come up with languages and factions. But the best way to demonstrate this even more is to show readers what happens to your living, breathing world when you introduce something new. A good example of this in One Piece would be the Paramount War. You have the death of Ace and Whitebeard and the introduction of Blackbeard as a new Yonko. This has a massive impact on the story and directly influences each arc afterward. But there's a catch. If you're going to do this, then it has to be meaningful. For example, one of my favorite games is World of Warcraft, and in its infamous Cataclysm expansion, fans were excited to see the aftermath of Deathwing's global destruction. In some cases this worked well, but in a lot of other cases all it really did was destroy what was previously a carefully crafted zone with its own intricate lore. So if you're going to destroy something, there has to be a trade-off. The destruction has to come along with meaningful payoff in the form of fleshing out the world in a meaningful way. And Ohkubo does this all the time. Now I bring this up because Season 3 is coming, so if you don't want spoilers, then maybe come back to this video later. But essentially what happens is the Whiteclads reveal themselves and take over the Empire. At the same time, they capture Captain Obi, and everyone has to choose between complying with the Empire or helping Company 8. This turns into an open brawl where Company 8 teams up with the anti-hero Joker, and they have to fight Burns, one of the most devout members of the church and one of the Fire Force's strongest captains. Now, I should actually mention that prior to all of this, we had everyone finding out about the church and how it's basically a big conspiracy to cover up the Infernals. And this had a direct impact on characters like Sister Iris, who had lived her life dedicated to the faith of Holy Soul and used it in a way that was genuinely constructive for both herself and the people she prayed for. But when we find out that it's all one big conspiracy, Iris begins to question her faith. But at the same time, it's not as simple as, well, the church is made up, so it's all bad, because the actual religion was still positively influencing people. So this is how Iris comes to serve as an example of a character that, in reaction to the church, actually believes that the religion is more important than ever. And this builds up to a fight between Shinra and Joker versus Burns. You have Shinra, who just wants to save everyone, even if it means taking down the Empire. You have Joker, the anti-hero that wants to support Shinra and create a better world. And then you have Burns. Burns is a character that suddenly becomes one of the bad guys. But it's believable because we know how influential the church is. We know from the beginning that people turn to religion because of how terrifying and mysterious spontaneous combustion is. As Captain Ho Yen explains, even if the church is a fraud, people still need something to believe in. They fall apart, which is what we see when everyone starts to question the church. But we find out Burns is so devoted to this church that he's been praying ever since he was a kid. So much so that now that the church is corrupt, Burns fights not so much to protect the church, but to reevaluate why he was ever praying in the first place. And none of this would be possible if it weren't for the brilliant world building. So this is why Fire Force has some of the best world building you can find. Ohkubo gives you the premise and builds off of that with a world that is all tied into the influence of that fundamental idea. He makes you question this world early on so that as you learn about each new institution, you're also trying to learn how each of them came to be and what their goals are. And just as you get to a point where you finally feel like you understand everything, he breaks it down so that he can flesh out the world even more and show you how this change impacts the growth of each sector of society as well as each character. It does take a while in the beginning, but once things pick up, they ramp up fast. Ohkubo makes time for small breaks, but even then they still tie into the story. There isn't a single chapter or a bit of information that doesn't tie together the world and its influence on the plot. So, while you may have your reservations about Fire Force, I cannot recommend it enough. It's got cool characters and great fights, but it's also got one of the most carefully crafted worlds that somehow gets even better the more you burn it down. But now I'd like to hear what you think. How would you rate Fire Force's world building? How does it compare to other stories? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And don't forget to become a channel member. You'll get that Excalibur emoji and badges. You can pick which series I cover next, and you can even get your name in future videos. Also check out my other Fire Force videos, which you can find in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.